Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today, I'm going to discuss another advantage that speculative fiction settings have over realistic settings, which is the fact that you can make it weird, unique, and interesting. Realistic fiction has to present a world full of things that are or things that were, and while they can whisk you away to exotic settings like Hollywood, Venice, Jerusalem, or Shanghai, the people and sights and technology they depict will never really defy physics and can only expand your imagination so far. A speculative setting can take you to a world where elves from another dimension are at war with dragons and demons from hell. It can take place on a planet that has so many suns that it only experiences nightfall once every 10,000 years. Instead of making the 2000th Tolkien-esque fantasy realm or Star Wars knockoff, you can and should take full advantage of the infinite possibilities available and make your setting weird. Subverting expectations. Before I discuss the different ways you can make your setting weird, I'm going to take a moment to define my terms. When I say you should make your setting weird, what I mean is that you should attempt to defy the genre and setting expectations that your audience will have when they first encounter your stories. For instance, Tolkien and other fantasy authors have established the expectation that elves are good, aloof, beautiful, and nature-oriented. And on the other hand, orcs are evil, rowdy, ugly, and eager for conquest. If you change just one of those facts each about elves and orcs, you'll surprise your audience. And if your audience is surprised, then they'll want to keep going, see what else is different. You can also change the technology level of your setting. Traditional fantasy takes place in the late Middle Ages of Europe, but you could model your setting on the Bronze Age, the Roman era, the Age of Sail, or even set it outside of Europe entirely. A lot of the famous works that have become pop cultural touchstones were very weird and unusual back when they first came out. Star Wars had amazing special effects that helped it stand out at the time, but it was the mysticism of the Force that really gave it staying power. Star Trek was one of many science fiction shows on the air in the 60s, but the reason it drew such a loyal following was because it explored a lot of contemporary political and social issues in a way that really wasn't being done in sci-fi television at the time. There have been dozens of magic school books published before Harry Potter came along, but the reason why that book series became such a phenomenon is because of the complete picture you get of a magic society living parallel to our own. A world full of details that the fans love to seize on and flesh out. Being weird and creative doesn't guarantee fame and success, but if all you do is go along with the crowd, then you're never going to stand out. Let your interests run away with you. The first and best way to be weird and unique is to focus on your personal interests and hobbies. For instance, if you like history, then you can make your setting more historically accurate than the average fantasy author. If you like animals, maybe you can have your setting feature magical horses and a lot of animal husbandry. If you have a physics degree, you can incorporate some actual physics into your science fiction setting, both as a way to teach your audience about physical laws and as a way to make your setting stand out. As a matter of fact, you could even create a setting that revolves around your hobby. I've mentioned this in a previous video, but there are a lot of Japanese light novels and animated shows that do just that. Just off the top of my head, there's the one about the medieval merchant trying to make a buck, the one about a god killer who has to research which cultures influenced each god in order to nail them, and the one where the main characters get trapped in an MMORPG and have to create a new society from scratch. The reason you should lean on your personal interests for ideas is really very simple. If you're doing something unusual that your audience doesn't expect, then you'll have to explain to your audience what it is about your setting that makes it distinct. That means you'll need to present a lot of information and ideas, more ideas than if you went with something generic. Chances are pretty good that you already have a lot of information and ideas about your favorite hobby. So, like I've said before, research is always a good thing, but a great starting point is the research you've already done on the hobbies you already love. Old techniques with new results. Another way to make your settings stand out is to use something previously established like magic or a hyperdrive or laser beams, and then have them work differently than how most people expect. In Fullmetal Alchemist, alchemy demands an equivalent exchange. You cannot create or destroy matter, and so if you want to make a sword, you'll need a steel ingot that's just big enough to make a sword. In Warhammer 40k, spaceships have to travel through the warp to go faster than light speed, but the warp is a nightmare realm full of demons and madness. Both examples start with something old, and then add something new that makes it much more complicated and interesting. Let's use the flying island setting to come up with another example. I've mentioned in a previous video that magic in this setting is restricted to men and represents elitism, so what if the way magic works reinforces that theme? What if using magic requires expensive components like solid gold and precious gemstones, and so using magic is impossible for an average person even if they had the talent and the training? You could then create a story that disrupts this status quo by having someone discover an island full of mineral wealth. Or maybe someone discovers a new magic technique that uses something less expensive, like copper or quartz stones. When the magic or technology of your setting is unusual, both your setting and the stories you can tell with your setting become more interesting. New techniques for old results. Another thing you can do to change up your setting is to change the way things appear to work, even if they are mechanically identical to something else that came before you. For instance, in Harry Potter, magic does basically whatever J.K. Rowling wants it to, which is definitely not a new concept. But she makes it interesting by describing details like how each wand has a unique power source and shape, each spell needs its own set of magic words and gestures, and many magic items have idiosyncrasies that give them some personality and not just a function. By changing the way things appear but not how they work, you can make your setting stand out without changing the kinds of stories you can tell. It gives you a chance to tell an old-fashioned story, but tell it in a new and interesting way. Changing appearances is particularly effective if you work in a visual medium, since those appearances count for more when you can show people what's different. Something else you can do is change both the way things look and the way things work, so don't think that these last two categories are mutually exclusive. Genre clashes. A genre clash is where you take two genres that don't normally overlap and then smash them together to make something memorable. Imagine something like a science fiction western, a strange combination that produced memorable TV shows at least twice. First with the Wild Wild West in the 1960s, and later with the Adventures of Briscoe County Jr. in the 90s. There's also a long-play YouTube show that does this called Dimension 20. Each campaign they play uses the rules for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but then the settings include a fantasy high school, an urban fantasy New York City, and a family backyard full of magical pixies and living toys. Then there's Shadowrun, a classic role-playing game that combines fantasy magic and races with a cyberpunk setting. The main thing you should remember is that genres are categories, not guidelines. In other words, you can use a genre to describe a work, and you can even set yourself a goal of creating a work that fits a certain genre, but you should never use a genre to dictate what your story can and can't be about. If you want to write a comedy with a dark ending, a science fiction story that takes place in the 1500s, a heist story with fantasy elements, or a historical drama with a modern musical soundtrack, then you should go right ahead and do it. With the right set of explanations and a good enough story, you can make any genre combination work. Mixed up species. Earlier, I suggested that changing one or two things about elves and orcs can make your fantasy races stand out. However, you can go a lot farther than that if you want to. Imagine what your setting would be like if your elves were cruel tyrants who use their powerful magic to subjugate the other races, while your orcs are a gentle folk that got disfigured by a magical accident and only want to live in peace and isolation. Imagine if your setting had an alien species that look like the classic warrior people, but act like peaceful philosophers, who just so happen to have an aggressive-looking art style because of their alien sense of aesthetics. The idea here is that other authors have set expectations for how certain fantasy races and alien species will act, and if you defy these expectations, you may unsettle some of your audience, but you'll also make your setting very memorable. However, you should also be careful about exactly how you present the different fantasy races and alien species, because authors often use these groups to represent various real-life cultures, ethnic groups, and nations. What this means is that, whether you intend it to happen or otherwise, your portrayal of elves or Martians may end up looking a lot like an unflattering stereotype of a real group of people. Now, you shouldn't let that stop you from creating the stories you want to create, but in general, it's a good idea to make sure that your aliens and fantasy races are at least a little complex and nuanced, and not just flat and one note. Upside-down stories. An upside-down story is what you get when you start with a standard story formula like the hero's journey or a classic fairy tale, and then tell it the wrong way around. Maybe you start with the climactic battle between good and evil, and then the rest of the story is about picking up the pieces afterwards, and all of the good allies turning on each other as they divide up the spoils of the evil realm. Or maybe you tell the villain's story, and explain what led them to becoming the bad guy of the classic tale. Upside-down stories don't exactly defy genre conventions, and they don't have to introduce new concepts to your setting, but they're still a great way to make your setting and stories stand out. Now, with that being said, one way to create an upside-down story is to take it out of its original context, drop it into your setting, and then figure out what it would look like after it adapts to its new surroundings. For instance, the original Star Wars A New Hope gets a lot of its ideas from the hero's journey concept that Joseph Campbell created. He got that concept by studying a bunch of myths and legends, but then Star Wars sets that journey in a science fiction universe. Then there's the novel Ella Enchanted, which includes all of the essential plot points from the Cinderella story, but then it adds a lot more details and plot points, and it makes the story much more complete and interesting. Calling something weird may have been an insult back in high school, but when it comes to developing a memorable speculative fiction setting, there is, at least in my opinion, no higher compliment that you could pay. So while you may want to start your setting construction with the basic fantasy or science fiction concept, don't be afraid to make it weird, make it crazy, and make it memorable. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.